We are joined by Margaret Power, Professor America of History at Illinois Institute of Technology, as well as author of Solidarity Across Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party and Anti-Imperialism. I want to start by thanking you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
I'm so happy to be here.
And we're
Thank
happy
you.
to have you. Yeah. So I want to start with Puerto Rico and how it's considered a territory, practically a colony, as I'm sure you could kind of explain and get into. But could you also kind of get into the history of how this came to be, from it being a Spanish colony to now an American territory?
Yes. Um, Puerto Rico, which is located in the Caribbean, and most people think of it, if they think of it at all, as sort of a vacation place to go, and great beaches and great water and a great rainforest and stuff like that, all of which is true, of course. But what is often overlooked is the fact that since the 1400s, Puerto Rico has been a colony, first to Spain and then since 1898 of the United States. And what that means is that for way over 500 years, Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican people have never had the opportunity to determine for themselves their own destiny, their own government, their economy, all the things that a sovereign population is able to do. And the United States went into Puerto Rico along with Cuba and actually the Philippines in the late 1800s, 1897, 1898, when Spain, which had been the colonial power both in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, was more or less a dying empire. It was also when the peoples of the Philippines and Cuba, and lesser so the people of Puerto Rico, were fighting for their independence. And they were not just fighting, they were doing a pretty darn good job at defeating Spain. The United States came in and said to all three peoples, we're here to help you. We're here to support your fight for independence. But that was never the case. We're here. The real message should have been, hi, we're here to get rid of Spain so we can take over, which is exactly what they did, and they've done ever since. And Puerto Rico was of each place had its own intrinsic value to the United States. Puerto Rico was particularly important because it is located right on the passage that runs through on the one side of Puerto Rico is the main sea passage in and out of the Caribbean. And especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, naval transportation was the key to sort of both the world's economy, the world's political control, the world's military domination. So basically, who ruled the seas ruled the world. So the United States wanted to get control not only the Caribbean, but all the countries around the Caribbean through the sea passage. And that's why Puerto Rico was so instrumental, especially after the Panama Canal was built. And then the United States was able to go from the Caribbean through to Asia as well. In addition, Puerto Rico had sugar. It also had coffee. It also had tobacco. And especially Puerto Rican women were experts in lace and embroidery, which they did in their huts, in their little houses, in the mountain towns, in the little villages. And they maybe sold something for 1 cent, 5 cents, maybe 10 cents, which was then sold in New York for $20, $30, $40. In short, there was this whole process of ripoff that was taking place for the Puerto Rican people. Puerto Rico also became a key strategic military base for the United States throughout the Caribbean. And just to give a sense of how important it was, and this is jumping ahead a bit, during World War II, German submarines were patrolling the area, and there was all this talk about German submarines landing or coming in and invading the United States. Well, Puerto Rico was one of the main places that the U.S. Southern Command was stationed so that they could patrol those waters. And the U.S. Navy built a Navy base in Puerto Rico, Roosevelt Roads, that was so massive that the British Navy, one of the most powerful navies in the entire world, had an arrangement if they had to evacuate the United Kingdom, then they could come and berth in Roosevelt Roads because the Navy base was so large.
I wish I could say that America interfering abroad for more economic or military reasons was surprising, but it's not really that surprising. So
Yeah,
Yeah, not so much so. I am curious if you could explain what are some of the legal distinctions between a state and a territory. Like, what are the differences in rights? I know that people from Puerto Rico are free to come to America, but they're
Hmm.
not free to vote in our federal elections. Are
Right.
there any other rights like this as well where it kind of differs?
Hmm. Yeah, well, Puerto Rico, I would say it's a colony. And by colony, what I mean is that Puerto Rico does not have any control over the government, over the economy. For example, I'll give a couple examples and picking up on what you just said. If you are born in Puerto Rico, you are a US citizen. But if you're a US citizen, if you live in Puerto Rico, you cannot vote in any federal election. You can't vote for president, you can't vote for senator, you can't vote for congressperson. But if you're a Puerto Rican and you move to New Jersey or New York or Chicago or wherever, then you can vote. I mean, it's like there is no rhyme or reason. It's totally illogical. Also, what it means, for example, that if you take goods in to Puerto Rico, they cannot come directly say you wanted to buy bananas at a cheaper price from Guatemala. Those bananas would first have to go to a seaport, a US seaport, probably in Florida, be transported onto US ships and then brought to Puerto Rico, all of which increases the amount of the cost to the people of Puerto Rico. So it's the U.S. in short controls what goes in and out of Puerto Rico, and in doing so, it means that people in Puerto Rico pay a heftier price, even though their salaries are much lower than here. And it also means that for some, and they said no rhyme or reason, means that after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in September 2017, Puerto Rico was devastated. Electricity wasn't there, water wasn't there. And what that meant was that Puerto Ricans also were totally dependent for the importation of food and water and everything from the United States, because part of being a colony means that in this case, the United States has turned the Puerto Rican economy into an economy that suits the needs of the United States, not the Puerto Rican people. So whereas before, Puerto Ricans were farmers, Puerto Ricans produced food that they needed for their own sustenance. Now a lot of that land has been turned over to US corporations, US businesses, US different facilities, so that food is not grown in Puerto Rico. They import food from Puerto Rico. Another example is the whole electrical grid. Puerto Rico has sun probably 365, if not what, 360 days a year. Puerto Rico's, like much of the Caribbean, ideal for solar power. But instead, and Puerto Rico, like much of the Caribbean, is prone and increasingly prone to hurricanes. So where are the electric power lines built? Above ground, meaning that you have a hurricane or you have a major storm, they get wiped out, which happens to Puerto Rico and this quite a lot. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to rebuild after 2017, we're putting the money into solar power. We're building underground lines. No, instead the company, the electric company, was privatized and sold to a Canadian company, which has no intrinsic interest in the needs of the Puerto Rican people. I mean, it's basically saying, look, the role of a government, from my point of view, should be to make sure that the people in the country's needs are met. That's a basic fundamental responsibility any single government has, any place in the entire world, whatever kind of system you live in. If you're a colony, you're doubly ignored and overlooked, because not only does the government not care about most citizens of this country, it doubly doesn't care about citizens of Puerto Rico because they can't even vote.
Yeah, it's disaster capitalism, so to speak.
Exactly.
I'm kind of curious as just like a follow-up, like in terms of rights like voting and things like that,
Yeah.
was this ever like a promise that America said, eventually we'll get to the point where you could vote, or has it kind of been like this will be the standard and always will be?
There's never been a promise, although at some points there was even discussion, should Puerto Ricans be citizens? When the United States went in, it invaded in 1898, there was a whole discussion about Puerto Ricans. At that point in time, the United States was basically the United States viewed itself as a white Protestant nation. Puerto Ricans were not white according to the United States racial setup, and they were Catholic. Therefore, they were inferior on two accounts. And the United States said, in order to make them citizens, we need to, first of all, Americanize them, which means civilize them, educate them. So one of the first things that the US did is it set up schools to teach Puerto Rican kids how to be Americans, which means teaching them English and teaching them that the father of their country was George Washington, and not teaching them that their country had its history. I think it's sort of the standard tools that colonies or those in power do all over the world, which is why history is such a contested field. We can see right now why there's so many attacks on historians and the teaching of history in this country, because if you teach people the history of this country, it can empower people to think, oh, wait a minute, I'm not a nothing. I'm not a people without history. I actually matter. And
Yeah.
I think that what the US government wanted to do was teach Puerto Ricans basically to think of themselves, in a sense, to internalize this idea, you are inferior people. Therefore, of course, you're not ready to vote. You're not ready to be a citizen. Maybe you'll be able to be a citizen at some point. So actually, 1917, during World War I, is when the United States government in Washington decided Puerto Ricans should be citizens. Puerto Ricans had absolutely no say in whether or not they were citizens.
Yeah, and I do want to get to kind of the broader question, so to speak, of the push for statehood now in Puerto Rico, like we're
Yeah,
seeing, and those kinds of things. But I do want to touch on a few more topics before we get
sure.
there, like how you write in your book about nationalism. I mean, it's in the title and everything. I wanted
Mhm.
to have you dive into this because, especially in America, with some of the forms of nationalism we see here, it's more so something that we think, at least on the left, that we think are done more by the bad guys. But in the context of Puerto Rican independence against essentially a domineering force, it's much more about true liberation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that eh, yeah, I think there's nationalism of sort of an imperialist nation like the United States, and then there's nationalism of a colony. And those are two very different things. And throughout much of the 20th century, especially following World War II, national liberation, anti-colonialism movements in Asia and Africa were the leading forces that were trying to defeat imperial world powers, both in Asia, I mean, both in Europe and to a lesser extent at that point, the United States. So nationalism meant we want to take control of our nation so that instead of, say, producing food so that people in England or France eat well, we're going to produce food so that people here have their basic needs met. I'm not saying things turned out exactly the way any of us would have hoped, but that was the idea. And for many people, nationalism represented the same as sort of being sovereign, and of saying that instead of teaching that we had no history, or instead of teaching that we are dependent and forever inferior, we're going to teach ourselves to take control and run our own country in the interests of our people. That's what being a nationalist meant. And so you think of people in this country, for example, Malcolm X was a nationalist. He was a black nationalist, and he basically, wanted to establish a black sort of the concept of black nationalism. Or I don't know if you know the Republic of New Africa in the U.S. southern states. And I think the same thing is for Puerto Rico. It's not sort of we hate you. It's that we want to basically have our nation where we live in dignity, where we're not the downtrodden. I think which is very different from sort of the white Christian nationalism, which is prevalent in this country among certain sectors, certainly not all, at this point in time. So I think that the sort of blanket word nationalism, yeah, you say like fascists, Nazis, and fascists in Italy, they're nationalists, but then so people who fought, say, in Algeria against French colonialism, well, they were nationalists too, but they weren't the same kind of people.
I think, yeah, a lot of it plays into where you are in the power imbalance. When you're
Hmm.
on the top, when you're the one doing the dominating, it's one thing to say, I want to be national, like continue this, like what are you trying to represent, versus when it's more about wanting your own liberation, your own statehood, your own place to call your home pretty much without being controlled or being dominated.
Yeah.
Now, in the interview that I saw you give, one of the more interesting topics I thought you touched on was Puerto Rico and its relationship to the Cuban Revolution. Could you kind of dive into that a little bit for our channel
Yeah.
as well?
Going back a teeny little bit, both Puerto Rico and Cuba were the last Spanish colonies to become independent. So they always viewed themselves as sister nations, sister republics. So forever, say, for example, Puerto Ricans and Cubans were together in exile in New York City and formed different organizations together. Puerto Ricans went to fight in Cuba for Cuban independence. This sort of long history of solidarity and sort of identification with each other. So when Puerto Ricans from the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, which was the party that fought for independence from the 1920s to the 1950s, when some of them went into exile, one of the key places they went to was Cuba. And this was before the Cuban Revolution. They became very close when they were there in the 1950s. They became very close with people like Fidel Castro, who then himself was sent into exile in Mexico. And others of them became close with Che Guevara when Che Guevara was in Guatemala. Some of them, Puerto Rican nationalists, were in Guatemala in the 1950s. They then, many of them met up again in Mexico City, where both the Puerto Rican nationalists and the Cuban revolutionary forces, they became extremely close, would meet together, would plan together, would strategize together, would have political discussions together. And then the Cuban revolutionary forces, July 26th movement, left, went back to Cuba, ultimately were successful, overthrew the dictator Batista, established the revolutionary Cuban government. Two of the Nationalist Party leaders, one of whom was married to the president of the Nationalist Party, Pedro Albizu Campos. The other was the Minister of Foreign Relations, Juan Warbe, his name, and Lara Meneses, who actually was Peruvian. So there were all these international connections. Went to Cuba. They became Cuban citizens, and they helped to set up the Cuban diplomatic mission in the United Nations. And then they both died in Cuba, actually. So there was this deep connection. And in addition to that, the Nationalist Party had staged different attacks, military attacks on the United States. The first one in 1950, the Nationalist Party staged an insurrection in Puerto Rico and attacked 7 different towns, basically for about 2 years. 2 years, 2 days, a little difference there, a little difference, held one town. And here's another interesting side note. The U.S. has bombed 2 U.S. cities twice, one Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the other Jayuya, Puerto Rico. Both of them were cities the bombing took place against non-white people. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, against Black people. In Jayuya, Puerto Rico, against Puerto Ricans. I just think it's important to say, when has the U.S. bombed U.S. citizens, U.S. cities? Well, when they're not white. Those 2 places. I think that's really quite notable. The rebellion in Puerto Rico was defeated. 2 Puerto Ricans who were a member of the Nationalist Party in New York City bought one-way tickets, traveled to Washington, D.C. Their plan was to assassinate President Truman because they thought it wasn't particularly based on the fact that it was him. I mean, of course it was, but that he was president. They thought, we've got to get worldwide attention on the fact that Puerto Ricans are not fighting Puerto Ricans, we're fighting for independence. It was sort of, the media was spinning it a way that was not true. So one of them was killed, one of them was wounded, and then went to prison. In 1954, 4 other Puerto Rican nationalists, again from New York City, again bought one-way tickets. They were led by a woman this time. So the military commander of action was a woman, Lolita Lebrón, which is not exactly totally common in the 1950s. They went to the U.S. Congress, went up to the visitors' galleries and opened fire and said, "Long live free Puerto Rico," in Spanish, of course. And They didn't kill anybody. They did wound some people. She shot at the cupola. She was not, again, they were not there to kill people. They were there to make a public statement and gain attention. They were in prison. These people became known as the five Puerto Rican nationalists. Cuba was instrumental in being in solidarity with these people and continually brought up both their freedom and the fact that Puerto Rico was a colony in the United Nations, in the Decolonization Committee. So Cuba was a stalwart supporter of the independence of Puerto Rico and the freedom of these prisoners, as they were later when different members of an armed underground group, the Armed Forces of National Liberation, which operated here in the United States and were captured mainly in the Chicago area. This was in the early 1980s. Cuba also was very instrumental in supporting their release. So there has been such a close connection between them.
And I'm interested if you could point to any other instances of maybe ways that solidarity has been shown across the Latin Americas, coordinating together against colonialism or imperialism, because I think it gives a strong message that people can relate to or resonate with globally about things we could do that could even apply to today.
Yeah, I think what happened is I'll start with the Nationalist Party, then broaden out. The Nationalist Party thought, no, we're this really pretty small island. We don't have tons of power, but if we had the backing and support of Latin America, that really matters. So they sent different emissaries, representatives throughout Latin America to garner support, to talk about the situation in Puerto Rico and to garner support. And they got a tremendous amount of it. Say, for example, in the 1950s, the Parliament in Ecuador passed a resolution, interestingly calling simultaneously for the independence of Puerto Rico from the United States and the independence of Algeria from France. So it was this global anti-colonial vision. Different literary and political leaders and student groups especially were very active. So to say the governments, different government figures in Chile and Argentina, again in Cuba and Costa Rica, throughout Latin America would send telegrams and sign petitions and write letters to the US government demanding that they be free. A similar situation was after the US government helped to overthrow Salvador Allende in 1973 in Chile. A lot of the Chileans who had supported the government became political prisoners, and many of them went into exile. Some of the people who had supported the Allende government actually were members of the Chilean military. Yeah, and they were particularly brutally tortured. They went into exile, some of them stayed and went into the resistance in Chile. In any case, for example, when the Sandinistas first took power in Nicaragua, when they were a revolutionary force, which I do not think they are now, when they were a revolutionary force, some members of the Chilean exile community went to Nicaragua. Say one was a captain, it had been a captain in the Chilean armed Air Force. He went and helped to train pilots in Nicaragua. Others joined the Sandinista military and fought against the Contras, the invading forces that the United States was sponsoring. That's on that level. On a very different level, I think sort of people-to-people solidarity has been really important, where I think for me the crucial element is people sort of developing this idea of solidarity, meaning we're in this together. Yes, I'm helping you, but I'm helping you because we are fighting the same enemy. We are working together for the same cause. So, for example, people throughout the Americas will hold benefit concerts to raise money to send to people who are in political need, or to send letters to political leaders to demanding the release of different political prisoners. And I think that really matters. And it helps also people oftentimes feel alone, or people feel helpless. And if you have this idea that, no, it's not just me, it's part of the whole hemisphere, it's the whole continent, and those of us who have this sort of same vision, we're working together. I think that matters.
Yeah, I think it sends a much stronger message. And like I said, one that I think even today could resonate globally for those against imperialism. I do
Yeah.
kind of want to jump forward to now to speak on the push for statehood for Puerto Rico.
Mm.
I'm curious if the Nationalist Party is still a part in this. If not, what's kind of the driving force behind it? And then is there consensus among Puerto Ricans about this idea of being like the 51st state of America, or what's kind of the feeling on the ground?
The Nationalist Party doesn't is sort of there, but it's not as strong. It doesn't have the political weight it used to. The independence movement is also present, but it tends to be on the weaker side and somewhat divided. But there are a variety of movements. There's an ecological movement, a feminist movement. None of these movements would support statehood. They instead support sovereignty for Puerto Rico, because what they say is that Puerto Rico basically is not United States. We we should have control over our nation. The push for statehood is coming from different forces. Interestingly, it's coming, interestingly enough, from some Republicans, but also from some Democrats, because the same as with Washington, D.C. If Washington, D.C. became a state, there's no way that would not be a Democratic state. If Puerto Rico became a state, it would be a Democratic state. So there are some people in the Democratic Party who think that a progressive position is to end colonialism by making Puerto Rico a state. But they're also thinking, and in that way, we'll get 2 senators and I don't know how many Congress people that'll be on the Democratic Party side. Okay, I understand that from their perspective, but what that's doing is, once again, using Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans to meet the aims and the goals of people, in this case, the Democratic Party in this country. It's not right. And there's not a consensus at all within Puerto Rico. There are some people who do want to be a state, and there's some people say, no, we don't want to be a state, because after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in 2017, here's sort of the clearest way of saying it. Some people would say, if we were a state, we would have been treated better. We would have gotten more funds, things would have been rebuilt, we wouldn't be the disaster we are now. Other people saying, this just shows we cannot count on the United States whatsoever. We have to count on ourselves. We have to build the solar power. We have to, instead of relying on importation of food from the United States, we have to build organic farms and hydroponics to use the resources that we have so that we're not so dependent. So there's no clear way. There's no decision being made within Puerto Rico right now. What is happening, though, because of the economic devastation in Puerto Rico, a lot of Puerto Ricans especially say doctors, professionals are leaving because they cannot support themselves and coming to the United States for jobs. At the same time, a lot of sort of IT people, hedge fund people, people sort of that have a lot of money, can work remotely, are going to Puerto Rico and buying up the land, especially from the white people, especially from the United States, buying land all around the coast, because Puerto Rico is beautiful. They're buying up land and building their own property, building hotels, making it even more difficult for Puerto Ricans who are at a much lower income level to pay the rent. It's sort of like gentrification on the whole island scale. It's not just sort of this neighborhood, it's the whole island is being gentrified. So it's a very conflictive situation, which is very little covered in the United States.
So I know after 2008, some very strict policies were placed on Puerto
Mm-hmm.
Rico. For the listeners, could you maybe explain what some of these were and the effect they played on this sort of larger picture about whether it be statehood for Puerto Rico or just how they feel towards America now?
Yeah. Um, basically, ironically, under President Obama, appointed a planning board basically made up of sort of these kind of stockbrokers and hedge fund guys from New York, financiers from New York City. And the goal was basically, oh, Puerto Ricans don't know how to run themselves. The government's really corrupt. We'll come in. And the coming in meant we'll privatize everything. So we'll take it out of the hands of Puerto Ricans and we'll put it into our hands and people like our hands, which meant that, for example, in the educational system, they said schools in Puerto Rico, like many places, are not just sites of education. They're also community institutions. They're where people gather together for all different kinds of things. That's true in the United States. It's even more true in Puerto Rico. Many of the schools in smaller areas of Puerto Rico, especially with the decline in population because people were leaving, didn't have the same kind of numbers to sustain a school. So the policy of the US appointed Secretary of Education was close and consolidate. I think that's familiar. Close and consolidate, not let's make things work better because this is really suiting the needs of meeting the needs of the community. So instead what they had all these schools closing, which was a disaster for so many people. So kids, instead of say traveling a little bit, would either have to travel very far or were unable to get to school or got there late. And the communities lost one of their key institutions. To me, that's sort of just one clear example. And then you magnify that on a larger scale, the healthcare system. All down the line, things were just taken over and taken away from Puerto Ricans and put into other people's hands, consolidated, closed, not based on the needs of Puerto Ricans, based on the economic needs decided by this board, the board. Same thing, say, with higher education. Money was not going to the University of Puerto Rico, which was the key educational institution, the premier sort of flagship school in the country. Repairs weren't made, positions weren't filled, scholarships were not given.
Yeah, it's sad to hear. I mean, but again, like I said earlier, I wish I could be surprised that America made a bunch of promises and all these kinds of things that they never really lived up to. I do want to say though, thank you again for joining us. I learned a lot. I feel like it's definitely was very insightful, and you have a wealth of knowledge that I was glad that you could share with us and me and my listeners. I want to say to them, anyone listening, if you enjoyed what we were talking about, I urge you to check out her book. It's Solidarity Across the Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party and Anti-Imperialism. I'll have a link to that in the description as well.
Okay.
And maybe sometime in the future, we could have you back on to discuss some more relevant topics.
Great. As you can tell, I like to talk.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, please get through Brandon, and I'm willing to travel and talk to anybody.
Awesome. And I'm always willing
Okay.
to listen. So thank you again. And
No, but you ask great questions and you have a very good manner, which makes a person feel relaxed around you.
well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I try. I'm learning, throughout my interviews.
Don't edit that out. You keep that in.
I will for sure, definitely.
Okay.
So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Awesome.
Bye-bye.
See ya. Yep, it was a pleasure.